Perfect. All right, the recording has started. That's perfect. All right, welcome, welcome. You are in a session about standardized testing for admissions as part of the Countdown to College evening. We're going to start here in 1 or 2 more minutes. We're going to start right on time. This session is being recorded and will be shared on the Countdown to College website and on our YouTube channel. All right, so I'm going to keep on giving people 2 more minutes. Welcome, welcome. You are in college admissions testing for college admissions for Countdown to College. I'm going to wait 1 more minute. One more minute-ish. All right, let's get started. My name is Heather Lowe, or Miss Lowe, as I'm known to my students in Mountain View High School. If you are in this session, you are here to learn about standardized testing for college admissions. Tonight, we are joined by Sue McLaughlin, who is the Senior Director of Recruiting and Staff Development for Compass Prep Test Prep. Sue attended Brown University and now is overseeing the training of all of the Northern California tutors for her company, and she is an excellent resource who has presented to my students previously. I'm really excited for her to be here tonight. You can use the Q&A throughout the evening. We'll also be dropping important links in the chat for you, and we'll be doing a Q&A live at the end of her presentation.
All right, let's get going. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining me tonight. I'm always thrilled to be invited to speak about everyone's favorite low stress topic of college admission testing. So at Compass, we really pride ourselves on being the keepers of sound information about college admission testing. We love info, and tonight's presentation is to really give you just an overview of things to start thinking about as you begin the journey for college admission testing. And in my over 8 years now with Compass, lots has changed in the world of testing, and then lots has also, stayed the same. Every year is overwhelming, and every year people get it together and we all figure out how to get through this so students are able to apply and then move on to school, and everything does work out in the end. But of course, we've all been dealing with these unprecedented, seemingly unending changes in all aspects of our lives over the past 2 years. And my goal here tonight is to really try to take away some of the stress and uncertainty around SAT and ACT, and to really take that stress level down a notch so that you come away from tonight's presentation with some concrete information and some next steps of what to do, again, as you start on this college admission testing journey. And one way to start to take away from the future stress is to take advantage of some resources. So Compass is able to provide a lot of free resources about college admission testing. I definitely encourage all of you to go ahead and download the Compass Guide to College Admission Testing. It's a really full resource that we update twice a year. There's a digital version that you can download here. It's everything that you would need to know, and some things not everyone needs to know about testing. Don't read it cover to cover. It's a lot of stuff, but it is something that you can kind of have on hand. And as you move through this process, it will give you the guidance that you need. And if you are someone who would rather have a physical copy of a guide, feel free to shoot me an email after this presentation. My email is here on the slide, and we can mail you a physical copy if that's something that you would prefer. So we have a lot to cover tonight, so I want to just get right to everything. I'm going to go ahead and just turn off my camera for right now so we can pay attention to the slides, and then I'll come back at the end where we can have a more face-to-face conversation for the Q&A. So here's our agenda for tonight. how are college admissions tests used? What role do they play in the admissions process? What does test optional mean, and really what does it not mean? What are the differences between SAT and ACT? How do we choose a test? When should we test? And then a little bit at the end about kind of how test prep works. And when I talk about test prep, either right now or anytime later tonight, I don't just mean one-on-one tutoring, which is something that Compass provides. There are so many different ways that students can prepare for these tests, whether it's taking a class or self-study or free resources, paid services. It's whatever works for the student and the family. But the most important thing is that there's some sort of preparation happening, and we'll talk about why that's useful later. And then, as we mentioned, tonight at the end of the presentation, we will have some time for Q&A. So please feel free throughout to go ahead and submit questions through that Q&A feature. Okay, here we go. So let's start with how the test scores are used and what role do they play in the college admission testing process or college admissions process. So when evaluating students, and their applications, college admissions officers are, they're often doing so holistically. So they're looking at the whole student. They're looking to create, a well-rounded student body that will be happy and successful on their campus. And traditionally, there have been three big categories of information related to the student's academic achievements. And you see those here at the top. So their grades. How is the student performing in school? Grades will always be an important factor in admissions. Rigor, how are students challenging themselves with the courses that are offered to them at their schools? And then test scores. So how did the student do on standardized tests? And for that, we're primarily been talking about SAT and ACT here for those tests. And then we have all of the things below and other parts that are also really important to the application. So no one thing is the deciding factor. And while, of course, tonight's presentation is about testing specifically, I do want to make sure that we're keeping all of this right sized. So all of these factors are important. They all round out, how awesome the student is and what they'll bring to a college campus community. Testing is important, but it's not the only important thing. But why is testing important? Since again, that's what we're here to discuss tonight. Let's start with grades for a comparison. So first here we have some data from the late 90s showing that the average grade, the most common grade across the country was a B. But now, as we get closer to the present time, that number of A's has surpassed the number of B's. And this is neither good nor bad, but what it could mean for an admissions officer is that there are more A's to parse through in general, and it's another challenge of distinguishing one student from another, one class from another. Whereas test scores, they don't have the same wiggle room or uncertainty around what they mean. Just by the nature of being standardized, they are predictable. And so a standardized test score to an admissions officer is an understandable piece of data, a piece of concrete information. The test is always scored on a curve, so that's what we're looking at here of how the scores kind of come out. So most students will fall under that high part of the curve, and then fewer and fewer students fall towards the scores on either end. The SAT. This is the ACT curve. The SAT curve is shaped a little bit differently, but it has the same idea. It's the same principle. The scores are normed back to a reference group. So a score of, let's say, a 26 on the April ACT that a student took is going to mean the same thing competitively. So how a student is landing among their peers as a score given on the June of a 26 given on the June ACT, or a score of 26 given on the July ACT, and so on. So we often have students and families that we're working with ask us things like, well, what is a good score? And the answer to that is really how we have to answer many questions in this field, and that's, well, it depends. So here's a little snippet of a much larger chart that we have in our guide with many more schools. And what this chart shows is the scores of the middle 50% of students who got into a particular school and then went to that school. So 25% had scores that were higher than the range you see, and 25% had scores that were lower than the range. So, a score doesn't automatically say that you'll be in or out for acceptance to a school. But what the ranges can give you is just, an idea of where you might stand competitively among other students kind of in that pool. At a school like Yale, roughly all of the scores are incredibly competitive. And I'm showing this chart here because it's some data like this might be part of what you use when you determine something that we're going to talk about later, when you determine whether or not you're going to submit scores as part of your application if you apply to a test optional school. So let's talk about test optional. Since the start of the pandemic, the big shift in the overall testing landscape has been a move to test optional policies at many colleges. And there's a lot of buzz around that. There's been a lot of confusion around that. It continues. So what does test optional mean? Test optional just means that you can apply to a school with or without submitting test scores. So with or without submitting SAT or ACT. Submitting scores is optional. It's your choice whether you're going to do that. And since you can submit scores to a school with a test optional policy, I'm going to suggest that we kind of shift our thinking as we talk tonight from the term like test optional to the term submit optional. So, as we just noted, a standardized test score is an understandable piece of data, so it could add to a student's application. So, while we've heard a lot of test optional policies and information since the start of the pandemic, test optional policies did exist before. If anyone can remember the before times, it feels like a lifetime ago for all of us at this point. But here's a chart looking at some data from the before times, pre-pandemic in 2019. And it's just showing a sampling of competitive US colleges and universities and what their testing policies were. So most schools in 2019 required either SAT or ACT scores with a college application. But there was a growing number of schools that allowed students to choose if they would submit scores or not. And those are the test optional ones you see here. And then a very small number of schools were something called test flexible, which means that they meant that they required scores, but they didn't have to be from SAT or ACT. They could be from other tests. So one of the reasons that many schools went test optional before the pandemic was partly out of a desire to help more students gain access to their application processes and therefore the opportunity to join their campus, since testing can sometimes be a barrier. And the idea was to try to create a more diverse student body on campuses. But now let's look at what has happened with this same kind of information. Things started to shift in the spring of 2020. This chart is kind of the latest information about how policies have updated for the class of 2022 and then for some of the class of 2023. We're kind of in the midst right now of those 2023 policy updates kind of happening if they might shift. And we expect more updates in the coming weeks. As you see, based on this information, there are now a small handful of schools that require SAT or ACT test scores with an application. Just this week, there have been a couple of announcements of schools that have gone from being test optional during the pandemic to now requiring scores again. One of the big announcements from just the other day was for MIT. They've gone back to requiring SAT or ACT scores. Just under half you see of this group are in a temporary test optional phase where they're seeing getting more data about test optional and how it plays out for a few more cycles on their campuses before they might go back to requiring tests, or they might make the move to be permanently test optional, which you see a number of schools have already made that decision. And as you're probably aware, with all the upheaval, the reason that schools went test optional starting in the spring of 2020 was because the standardized test dates were getting canceled all over the place. So students weren't able to test. So, the conditions and ability to test was varied all over the country. So schools basically had to go test optional. Otherwise, students wouldn't have been able to apply to their schools. And then I also want to note that you do see here that about, almost 36 or so schools have gone test-free. So I want to make sure we understand what that means. Test-free means that SAT and ACT scores will not be a factor in admissions decisions. So some of these schools still might have scholarship opportunities or other things that might have a test score component, but test scores, for anyone will not be a part of the equation when determining if the student is going to get accepted into that school. So most notably for our area, the UCs are test-free. So they will not consider, any UC school will not consider SAT or ACT test scores when making admission decisions or when awarding scholarships. And then another hot off the presses announcement that you may have already heard is that the Cal State system, the CSUs, and they also just announced that they will stay test-free. So what does this mean? So what does this kind of mass adoption of test optional mean? Our guidance to students is that you should still plan to test. So take the SAT or the ACT so you have the option to send scores. You don't need to know, though, if you will send the scores. You don't need to know that ahead of time until it comes time to kind of decide when you're sending in your application. And students may end up choosing to submit test scores to some schools and not to others. So, we are in a much, much better place than we were, 2 years ago, a year ago, with regards to official tests being able to happen. We anticipate, fingers crossed, that it will continue to be easier to test. So, as a sophomore or a junior now, you'd probably have to have a compelling case, and to discuss it with your counselor at school if you're not planning to test at all. It's possible that a student could end up applying to only test-free schools. It's also possible that a student might not end up submitting any scores to their test optional schools they apply to. But what you want to be careful of is to not put limits on your opportunities like too early in the game, because it's likely that students won't really have their full list of schools that they want to apply to until later summer before senior year. So by that point, what you don't want to be doing is scrambling to figure out how am I going to take a test at the last minute. If you do decide that a school you want to apply to, it would be beneficial for you to have what you think would be strong scores to add to that particular application. So a natural response that some families ask is if they should really trust the test optional option. Is it a trap? Does it label a student as a bad test taker? And while you should trust the intentions of a test optional policy, your decision to submit or omit the scores is really going to be highly situational. And you might end up submitting scores to some schools and not submitting scores to others. But this skepticism that pops up sometimes around test optional policies mostly comes from the admissions outcomes of the highly selective colleges. And most applicants to those highly selective schools will still submit scores, and they're usually very competitive scores. So as an example, to kind of show how this works, I thought we could take a look at the University of Chicago, very competitive school. So the University of Chicago went test optional years before the pandemic, way back in 2018. Again, feels like a lifetime ago for me personally. Although, going test optional did allow the University of Chicago to enroll a more diverse freshman class, which was awesome. That was the intention. Only about 10% of students didn't submit scores, and around half of the submitters obtained scores that were nearing the 99th percentile. So this type of response is what we've seen again from the most competitive schools as test optional has expanded. And for a little more about what happened, it's important to note that when a school goes test optional, that school does not become easier to get into. So, all of the other competitive standards still apply, as the school is still trying to build the class of the academic caliber that they've been seeking. More students will throw their hat into the ring, so to speak. So, thinking that their test scores were maybe what was holding them back. In some cases, maybe that was true. But testing is usually not the one factor that decides or denies, admission. And when more students apply for the same number of available spots, then the admit rate goes down, and then the school is even more competitive than before. So as you can see here with this data, by easing the standards of eligibility, the University of Chicago built an outsized applicant pool without any more available spots. So there's a rise in applications, and then naturally, there's a fall in the admit rates from that. So like I've already said, you don't have to submit scores to a test optional school, but you should plan to test so that you have the option to submit. And then your decision to submit with your application to an individual school is going to depend on a number of factors. And it's really something that you can decide later. And then with the guidance from your school counselor in your counseling team, who really have a sense of like the full picture of your application. So then to show, a little bit more about how this process can be pretty nuanced, I thought it would be helpful if we just took a quick look, excuse me, at some language from a variety of like competitive schools and kind of the different things that they've said about submitting scores. So here we have Notre Dame, their test optional through 2023. They're saying we're convinced that we have greater wisdom than caving to pressure of having a higher test score average. And then Northeastern, test optional through 2026. For applicants who choose to submit standardized testing, we will introduce testing into the discussion during the selection process. Standardized testing will never be introduced into the discussion for students who choose to apply test optional, so not sending in scores. Davidson, test optional through 2023. Their policy at this time speaks to their commitment to access. A few more to take a look at. Here we have Northwestern. They are saying that a combination of grades and standardized test scores has been shown to strengthen the prediction of a student, talking about an academic success in college. That's what they have seen. From Rice, the scores are merely one factor of many that are considered in the admissions process. A couple more to show you this. You can see just how different all of these kind of thought processes are and how nuanced they could be. From Carleton, applicants are encouraged to consider if their standardized test scores represent their academic ability and potential. And Purdue, they're saying that they're test flexible is the language that they prefer to use. And that for them, that means that if a student can take an SAT or ACT, they would prefer that they would do so. But if a student is not able to do that, then that's not going to negatively impact that student's application. And then for Gonzaga, if a test score is a good representation of who you are as a student, then you may wish to submit test scores. University of Virginia, those without scores will not be penalized during a holistic review process. And Wake Forest, I thought this was kind of funny. For the record, it's not that we think standardized tests are evil, but then they're saying if you think your scores are an accurate representation, submit. If you feel they're not, then don't, and you won't be penalized. And then for anyone who's interested in seeing some data around what has happened, this is very limited data, but just a quick snapshot. What has happened with test optional schools and students who have submitted versus not submitted scores. This is a limited sampling of some popular schools who choose to share their admit rates for students and to highlight how many admitted students submitted scores and how many did not submit scores. This is for test optional schools and students who either graduated from high school in 2021, so most of the data, the blue data, and then students who will graduate in 2022, which is some early data with the green bars. The striped bars are students who were admitted without submitting tests. The solid bars are students who were admitted with submitting tests. And what we see here is that, some schools landed at being truly test optional. So admit rates were the same for submitters versus non-submitters. So, the biggest standout here is with Northeastern for early decision. And others, you see that there's a higher number of admitted students that are among those who submitted scores. So looking at Emory and Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech actually also is one of the other schools that recently went back to requiring SAT and ACT scores. So, but with this data, and of course, this is a big but, there are other factors here. So it's an important consideration. Students who submit are also likely to have higher scores. And when given the option to submit, they will. And as we just looked at with the University of Chicago. And then students with higher scores in general may also just have stronger applications in other areas for those particular schools. So, maybe there's a correlation here. And I thought it was interesting just to note for anyone who is more kind of data driven. Overall, I think that this supports the guidance in general that most students should plan to test and that you'll submit scores to some schools and not to others. That is okay. That is all part of the new normal in this process and will continue to be. So now we know, oops, just click ahead from that. Now we know that we are going to plan to test, right? So what do we do from here? Which test should we take and when should we take it? So I brought you this cartoon to bring you a little bit of fun after showing you all of that data. There's not too many funny things in test preparation, but here you go. And you'll start to hear all kinds of things like this where we're talking about SAT and ACT when we're talking about college admission tests, and you'll hear that one test is better than the other, but really no test is better than the other. So colleges will accept both tests equally. It used to be that the SAT was more popular on the coast and the ACT was more popular in the middle of the country, but that distinction really is no more. You can take either test for any college in the US. Compass does test prep with students all over the country, and we really see roughly about half our students prep for each test. So some are ACT and some are SAT. The tests are actually pretty similar, but there are some differences. So I thought next we could just kind of run through what are we even talking about with these tests? What do they look like these days? So let's look at them. So both tests are designed to be taken usually by high school juniors and seniors, right? So they're covering like up to that kind of curriculum. Both tests will cover reading comprehension, grammar and writing skills, math up to pre-calculus. Both tests right now are about 3 hours. So they're events for students. Both of them require you to pace yourself, and both will hit you with all the questions in one content area at one time before you need to switch gears and do something else. So like you do all of the reading and then do the writing language and then do the math or whatever it is on the other tests. You probably do see here that there's a difference with the green box. The ACT does have a science section. So it's really, though, just more of a reading comprehension section with tables, charts, graphs, passages about science topics. You don't need specific outside science knowledge to manage the section. And the SAT actually has similar types of questions, but they're mixed throughout the other sections instead of happening like all at once, like they do on the SAT. And you probably also noticed the big red text in the middle, the digital SAT. So the College Board announced earlier this spring that they're changing from a paper test to a digital test. It's going to start with the fall 2023 PSAT and then the spring 2024 SAT. So this does not affect at all current sophomores or juniors. So current sophomores and juniors, no impact. Everything stays as it has been. This will affect current freshmen. But there's plenty of time to get all of the info as it comes out and to be prepared. There's a nice long timeline for all of this to be kind of sorted out and for those students to be ready. We will be ready at Compass. Your counseling teams will be ready. So if you are on this call with a younger student, like don't worry about this now, just kind of stay in touch and we will make sure that everyone has what they need to be ready for this pretty big change. Getting back to what's happening right now with the tests as they exist for juniors and sophomores, one of the biggest differences between SAT and ACT is probably with the math sections, with how the content is. SAT has 2 math sections, one with a calculator, one without. ACT has 1 math section, use your calculator all the way through. ACT covers like a broader range of topics, but doesn't go super in depth into any of those. But SAT math is more limited in what it covers. There's more similarity in the different types of things that you'll see, but it does go more in depth into those topics. So it's primarily algebra and data analysis. And I bring this here because this is sometimes how students might choose which tests they take, kind of how they're feeling about the math. There is a really deep dive into this as one of the resources we have in our guide. So if anyone is interested in exploring that further, that's another thing that you might check out as you're kind of exploring resources after tonight's presentation. So, getting familiar with the tests is important. So part of that starts for students with the PSAT. So in October of junior year, students will get some real world experience with SAT content by taking the PSAT. So the PSAT is not a college admissions test, but it is pretty much a shorter version of the SAT. The score range for each section, so there's math and verbal, each section goes up to 760. So the total score, it goes up to 1520 instead of a total score of 1600, which would be on the SAT. Basically, that's just to say the PSAT scale is vertically aligned with the SAT. So basically, whatever you got on the PSAT, you can kind of think of that as like what you would have gotten had you taken the regular SAT instead on that same day under the same conditions. You can use it as like a kind of a starting score, thinking about SAT. For juniors, the PSAT is the qualifying test for the National Merit Scholarship Program. So you may have heard of it for that as well. The National Merit Scholars will be a very, very small group of the tip top of all test takers. But for all students, the PSAT offers a really good, like low stakes, real world standardized test opportunity. Again, it's not a college admissions test, but it does mimic the experience. And then students get scores to see how that went, as well as how it felt. And those scores come out in December after the test. So taking the PSAT, seeing results can really help students determine if they're going to take the SAT officially or if they'll take the ACT officially. Because students really only have to take one of the two. You don't have to take both SAT and ACT officially. You can choose one test. The best way to determine which test you'll take is to get some data and make an informed choice. We advise students to do practice tests rather than like sign up for an official test and just see how it goes. The scores, as well as the student's experience with a practice test, are really valuable tools in making that decision of which path to go down for which exam. And a practice test then isn't seen by colleges if you do decide to submit your scores with your applications. Practice tests are also valuable because taking the SAT or the ACT is much more like an event than like a regular school exam. It's an experience for students, like we saw earlier. It's very long. There's a lot happening there. So just taking a full length exam for practice is just a good tool for preparation. Compass does offer practice tests. We do online proctored or self-proctored or online timed exams that are taken on a computer. And I bring this up because if a student does, let's say, a practice ACT, then they might compare that with their PSAT results, or a student might take a full-length practice test with either. And we do have a special to help you kind of get some testing data if you want to kind of give this a try. We do have a special free practice test opportunity just for Mountain View and Los Altos families. You can choose to take either a practice SAT or a practice ACT. So one or the other for a full-length test. And I'll share this also at the end of the presentation too. And there's a link and a coupon code if that's something that you would like to try to do to get that data. So we still haven't determined though, how will we make the decision about which tests we're going to take. So once you have your data, so full length practice SAT or PSAT or practice ACT, then we have a tool where you can compare your scores. This is our concordance chart. This is found in the guide. It's on the Compass website, where you can see if a student is more competitive in one test or the other. So here it's pretty straightforward how to use the concordance, but here we have a student who got a 22 on the ACT and then a 1200 on the SAT. That student would have a more competitive score for the SAT. So they could just say, forget it to the ACT and just move forward on the SAT path and kind of come up with a plan for signing up for the test and preparing for that. And they wouldn't have to look at the ACT ever again. Another student, 31 on the ACT, 1400 on the SAT. This student falls into the judgment call area. So this student has scores that are equally competitive. So when looking at all their peers and kind of where they're landing, they're falling about the same on either test. So the scores themselves are not a clear winner, to make that decision. So most students will, and a little more than half of students will end up in the judgment call area when they compare their scores here. And it kind of makes sense, I think, with what we've just talked about the test similarities. But if we're in the judgment call area, we still have to make a decision. We still have to choose a test. We do not need to take both officially. So what do we do from here? Really important to keep all of this like right sized, as I've been saying. It's an important decision, but it shouldn't be like overly fraught. Either test is a good choice because colleges will take either one. The pacing on the two tests is a little bit different. So that's why it's another value point of a student sitting through a full practice of each, so they can experience that, since the student is the one who has to do the exam officially. ACT is a faster paced test overall. I think the questions are a little more straightforward, but you have to move very quickly. The SAT gives you like more time per question, but then there are some questions that can take a little bit more time to unpack with how they're structured. Some of those questions that take a little bit more time to unpack are kind of fall in the reading section, which is why I have reading on this list as well. SAT has some questions that are like paired together, where you have to kind of answer two questions at the same time. And then I mentioned already some of the differences in math with the content, with the calculator use. SAT math also has grid-ins, which are ones where they're not multiple choice. You're coming up with your own answer. We talked about the science section as well. So as the student kind of experiences both of the tests, hopefully in practice, you can take these things into account and kind of choosing which test to kind of move forward with. And then the final two things on the list about the test dates and accommodations, these are more like logistical things that might help a student decide which test they're going to take, and also good things to consider. So SAT and ACT are only offered on certain dates, right? So there could be a test date that just fits better in a student's life with what else is going on with, school obligations or extracurricular events or family events or things like that, where a certain test date might just work out better, and all things being equal, that could be a way to choose which test. When does the student have time to make this happen? And then if a student is going to test with accommodations, such as like extended time, then that's an application process that the student has to go through with the College Board for the SAT or with the ACT for the ACT. We have more information about how to do that on our website and in the guide, and your counseling team also would be able to direct you to kind of that process. If you feel like that's something that you need, then that's something to get some guidance on. But I bring it up here because sometimes students will be approved for accommodations by one test maker and not the other. So then they would usually go with the test where they're going to receive their accommodations. So then from here, let's talk about when we're going to do all of this. When is the testing actually going to happen? So this is a typical, like we call it a sensible timeline for many students for testing. So most students will plan to take their official SAT or ACT sometime in the spring of junior year. So of course, there are some students who may do their first test earlier, others who will benefit from waiting until summer or early fall, so fall of senior year. But taking a test in junior year spring is really the most common plan. So that's what I wanted to talk about here tonight. If you are thinking of starting to test earlier or later, I'd advise you again to check in with our counseling team for some specific guidance. But let's talk about the sensible plan. In the fall of junior year, we just mentioned, students will take the PSAT at school. It might also be a good time to do a practice ACT for comparison. If you're a junior now and you haven't done an ACT yet to compare with your PSAT, that's also fine to kind of do that in the early spring as well. And then once a student kind of chooses whether we're on the SAT track or the ACT track, start to plan for when to take it officially and then register for the exams. So we do know that the seats are filling up pretty fast for the official test. So it's best to try to register as soon as you're ready to do so. And just, if a student doesn't see any available spots near them and we're expecting them to be easier as we get into like the next testing season, just keep trying to register, because we have heard of spots opening up for students who just keep trying to register. So the possible dates for testing in the spring are listed here. The SAT is offered in March, May, and June. The ACT is offered in February, April, and June. Plan to sit for one of those dates. And it's really good to plan to sit for the test twice. Some schools would do something called super scoring, where they will you're able to combine your different sections across multiple sittings of the test and kind of create a stronger like composite or total score. It's also valuable to kind of know for a student that they're going to test again and to not feeling like they're putting all their eggs in one basket. And it can kind of take a timeline for students to feel like they're hitting their peak scores. So, planning to test twice is an important kind of overall plan. Those 2 sittings might happen twice in the spring, but they certainly don't have to. Some students will do, once in the spring and one time later, whether that's in the summer or in the fall. And then I have AP exams on here in late spring, because they happen in a 2-week period in May, because if students are taking any APs, taking those exams, then they'll just want to take into account like that preparation for those exams when they're planning how they're also going to get ready to take the SAT or the ACT, so that we're not being too overloaded in that particular month. So then after testing in the spring, use the summer to review, like, how did it go? What happened? Any adjustments to goals? The real college list is starting to really take shape. There are also lots of opportunities to retest in the fall. So it's really important that you always pay attention to deadlines with applications. So when does a school need the scores to be in? Deadlines can vary, particularly if a student is applying anywhere early decision or early action, also for regular decision. Usually the September ACT and the October SAT are fine for early parts of applications, but you always want to check. It's one of those things that's like, depends. So that information is readily available on the admission sites of what the deadlines are for each particular school. But then the rest of the fall dates are usually fine for any regular decision applications. So use the fall dates if you need them. I think sometimes we get caught up in getting this done so early, but there's lots of opportunities throughout the fall, and students can do what makes the most sense for them and their individual plan. So then as our final topic, I thought we could just do a quick check-in about what it means to prepare for these tests and what these tests are testing and what they're not testing. So SAT and ACT are really different from tests that students are taking at school. So yes, they do involve content knowledge. So you do have to have, certain knowledge about grammar and math, right, to be able to answer questions correctly on the exams. They also do allow for some command of strategies. So getting, familiar with how the questions work. By nature of them being standardized, there's only so many different ways that these questions can look. And then the structure of the questions, it means that sometimes, a strategy that a student has learned might unlock a problem that maybe the content is a little bit beyond, right, what they've learned in school, but they're able to kind of figure it out because they're familiar with how the test typically works. With emotional discipline and clock management, these tests are events, like I mentioned a little while ago. Getting ready to take the SAT or the ACT is really more like preparing for a big game, or preparing for acting in a play or some other like big event where you need to build up stamina, you need to build up muscle memory, you need to build cognitive control. The tests are timed, they all involve pacing. A prepared test taker is going to understand really how the test works and how it works for them specifically. And then understanding how the test works and how it works for them is going to make that tester better equipped to handle any of those unexpected challenges that could pop up on test day. And we've heard all kinds of things from students, like a room is really cold, there's noise outside, including construction, and we've heard outside of buildings. Maybe the student didn't eat enough and they're feeling really hungry, or they didn't sleep all the night before, or someone next to them is like tapping their foot or their pencil. So a student who is feeling more prepared for what they're going to experience of what they can know about the test, it helps them better manage all those kind of unknown outside factors that might pop up. So to illustrate just a little bit more of kind of the value of being prepared, I brought you our heat map from the ACT English section. This is one of the more exciting things in test preparation. Basically, what this chart shows is it's data from several thousand different ACT test takers over 11 different forms of the ACT, so like different sets of questions. And the ACT English section has 75 questions. You only have 45 minutes to go through it. But what you see for each of these boxes represents one question. And the green boxes are the ones where, very easy. Most students got those questions correct. And then the dark red boxes were the very difficult questions where a few students got those correct. So what you see here, and what a prepared test taker would know, is that the ACT English section doesn't really have an order of difficulty. So you can come across easy, medium, and hard questions throughout the section. So a prepared test taker knows that they should probably pace themselves evenly throughout this section so that they don't miss, an opportunity to pick up an easier question at the end because they spent too much time on a really hard question at the beginning. So all the questions are worth the same, number of raw points. So you don't want to again, spend your time in an inefficient way and miss questions that were really in your wheelhouse. And that's something that someone who's worked through this material before would know that that's what that looks like. The ACT math section, though, is totally different. This is roughly an order of difficulty, kind of in beginning, middle, and end. So a student here might have a very different pacing plan from another student, depending on kind of where they are with the content. So for some students, it will make sense for them to pace themselves evenly to get all the way to the very end where the hardest questions are. Where other students, it might actually be wiser for them to spend more time on questions earlier in the test and really get those correct because they fall right within their wheelhouse, and then guess on the questions all the way at the end. So, prepared test taker would know what their kind of personal plan is for this section. And the SAT math section is similar to this. Starting over in each section and then starting over with the multiple choice versus the grid-ins. So I just thought that was kind of a helpful way just to kind of give a little preview of kind of the value of doing some sort of preparation and not just going into the test cold, because they're standardized, there's a lot that students can learn. So with all of that, that covers kind of the overview. I hope everyone's feeling okay for tonight's presentation, and I really appreciate everyone's attention. And now we can do a little Q&A. So I have come back.
Thank you so much, Sue. I also wanted to mention that while that test optional slide that was showing students who had submitted scores and hadn't submitted scores in admissions, right? It's just one piece of the application pie. So, right, correlation does not equal causation. And there are a lot of ties also that just more well-resourced students with more resources to practice testing. They also have other parts of their application that also assist them in this process that are not accounted for in that slide. So it's just one piece of data, and it might look like your goose is kind of cooked if you take a quick look at it, but just keep in mind that amongst the pieces of an application, there are other pieces that you're not seeing that also correlate to students with resources. I have some really great questions in the Q&A for you, Sue. So one question is, if you take more than one SAT or ACT, does College Board send the average score, or could we request the highest score to be sent to the college?
Yeah, that's a good question. So schools also have different policies on how they would like you to send those scores. So some of them will allow you to do score choice, where you are choosing which ones are being sent. Others are looking for your kind of whole testing history, but when they're looking for that, they're still looking at your testing supportively. So they want to see, everything, that you don't leave something out. And then I briefly mentioned earlier that some schools would do something called super scoring, which means you can submit, say you took the ACT twice and you ended up with, different scores, and they'll take the highest English and the highest math and the highest science and the highest reading and recombine those into the highest composite score, which could be higher than each of the sittings alone. So that depends on the school. The other thing that a lot of schools do now is they allow self-reporting. So when you're applying, you are you are providing the scores yourselves, and then you just have to kind of share it with them after you've been accepted to kind of like prove it. So you want to be honest, but you don't necessarily have to be kind of sending official reports to all of the schools that you're applying to, which makes this a lot easier.
Yeah, I think some parents and students worry that if they see like the whole score report history, that there are going to be assumptions that are made by admissions staff. But when they're super scoring right, they're looking for where the student is the strongest. There are some admissions offices where it's done by an assistant and the admissions rep reading it doesn't even see the entire score report. So the anxiety over like, does a college get to see how many times the student has taken the SAT or ACT? I would try to relax about it and maybe ask a few admissions counselors and get some answers, because it can really depend on the college in particular. More questions are coming in as you're answering them, Sue. Thank you so much. Okay, this is a really good one. Are there tests that are also like, are there standardized tests for international schools? So there's multiple parts to that question. I don't know which angle you want to tackle, but I'll let you start.
Well, I'm not as familiar with for international schools and what tests that they would require, because that's then you're getting into like a whole other realm of possibilities. I do know that, you know, some international schools could be looking at SAT or ACT. I would say if a student is looking for at international schools, then I would start looking now at like what those requirements are, so that there's a long timeline to kind of figure that out. Yeah, I don't have additional insight for international schools because we're primarily working with kids and looking to go to US schools.
It can really vary from my experience. It seems like in Canada and in the UK, there are some schools that are open to SAT, ACTs. What's really common actually internationally is AP tests. 3 AP tests is what I've seen. But right, like Cambridge has their own tests. So it really depends on your students' goals and what country we're talking about. And what about, in your experience, Sue, can students register now for testing in the fall?
Yeah, so the test dates, if I'm remembering this correctly, the test dates open like for kind of like for the academic year. So I believe the College Board opens the SAT dates like in June, and then the ACT opens their dates in July. And then all those dates will be open like through the next school year, essentially. So a student can't register for like the August SAT until June when that opens.
Yeah, they have to wait. You have to wait. Let's try, how many times is too many times for taking the SAT?
Yeah, that's a good question that we get a lot. So, I mean, it depends, right? It depends like everything else. So it's very common to take the test twice. And like we said earlier, that's really a plan, you know, take it twice. And then if you are really confident after one sitting, like, then just don't take it again. That's fine. Taking it 3 times is also, you know, not a huge, that's not a problem necessarily, but if a student is taking it more times than that, there is kind of the law of diminishing returns. So it's kind of like looking at what is the specific reason for that student to be taking it again. There could be a really good reason. But it's also where, you know, a student should also be doing other things with their time than just taking the test so many times over and over again. Like we've mentioned, this is one part, it's like one piece. There's so many other things that flesh out the student's application. So, you know, we certainly don't recommend taking the test like every time, you know, it's available. I don't think anyone would recommend that. 2 or 3 times, I would say, would be pretty normal. And then of course there's an exception to everything, and, you know, it might make sense for a student to take it again.
I think this is a really good question. Will you get your score back in time to decide whether to take the test again? Like, how long does it take to get your results?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it takes roughly about like 10 days to 2 weeks kind of across the 2 tests. Sometimes it can take longer for the ACT. That tends to be the one that more lags. And I know that the June SAT like takes a month instead of like the usual about 2 weeks. It's something what they're doing. I don't know exactly why, but that's what always happens. So there's, the timeline between one test and when you get your scores back and when the registration deadline is for the next test is like pretty compressed. So it's usually a good idea if you can to try to plan ahead and register for that next date, already, without waiting to get the scores. But especially with right now, with kids trying to get seats for tests, that you don't want to leave it necessarily to the last minute of like you get the results and then you're trying to get late registration, or trying to get on a wait list or something. That's adding to the stress of all of this, and we're trying to bring the stress down instead.
Yes. Will the ACT or SAT be better depending on like the major or area that a student is applying for when they are applying to college?
So in general, schools are not preferring one test over the other. A student's major shouldn't really impact their decision to take either SAT or ACT.
Yep. There are a bunch of good questions. When should a student start preparing for the spring test? How long does preparation take?
Yeah. So I mean, and the preparation can mean lots of different things, but in usually good guidance is spending maybe 3 months getting ready to take a test. And the reason for that is because as I was mentioning earlier, these are not tests like regular tests at school. This is not like cramming, and then just getting all the information out there in the morning. This is building up stamina. It's like learning some strategies. It's reviewing content that students haven't seen in a while that's going to show up on this test, and kind of bringing all that to the forefront and getting really comfortable and confident with moving through the test at a pretty fast pace. So that it takes some time to build up those skills. So that's why doing it, over a few months is probably going to have a better outcome than doing a really short 1 week of just kind of really condensed preparation. Again, for most students, there's exceptions, but
yeah. I think this person's question is kind of answered by your guide for the Compass prep guide that you have up there. I think in that guide, do they show in comparison for certain subject areas, how much geometry is on the SAT versus ACT? Okay, so
yeah, there. Yeah, for sure. That's
great.
searchable in that digital guide for sure. Yeah.
Excellent. So William, I would refer to that. It's a great question. I'm going to take one or two more. Do you have to take both the SAT and the ACT, or will schools allow one or the other?
One or the other. You do not have to take both. So just pick one and then go with that one, and don't stress about what if I taken the other one. Just put your efforts towards one.
And then last but not least, what is the PSA 10, or is there a reason to take the PSA 10 in the 10th grade?
So it's basically just another version of the PSAT. So it's the same. It's not a college admission test. It doesn't go anywhere. It's not a national merit qualifying test. But it is another experience of sitting and taking a standardized test that's timed. It feels like a little bit of pressure. So it's not, but it feels that way to students. So for having that experience, there's value there if that's something that's offered and if the student feels up for it. But it's not something that all students do.
All right. And with that, we have a few more questions left, but if you still really have a question that you'd like to get answered, there's Sue's email up there. Once again, my name is Heather Lowe. I'm the college counselor, one of the college counselors at Mountain View High School, and Laura Duran at Los Altos is also running this event and would be another great person to reach out to. Sue, thank you so much for your time. You're such a great resource. I'm so glad that you were here with us, and thank you again.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. You're all going to be fine. So good luck on this process and enjoy the rest of your event.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.